The United States Constitution is more than a document. It's a living experiment in freedom. The First Amendment protects our voices. The Second protects our right to keep and bear arms. But somewhere between speech and weaponry, the line has blurred. Technology once gave us the power to build tools. Now, it gives us the power to build anything, at home, in minutes, for virtually no cost. Artificial intelligence can write code, design weapons, and distribute information faster than any government can plan. It can replicate human ingenuity and amplify human intent. So what happens when AI meets the Second Amendment? When a machine can create a gun, a bullet, a bomb, and the algorithm decides who can access it?
The Second Amendment, as we have mythologized it and propped it up in cultural memory, probably never existed and therefore is always at risk and therefore exists by always being at risk in that way. And so, no, the Second Amendment is probably perfectly safe as an American myth of sovereign individualism or kind of frontier mentality.
The debate over free speech, safety, and innovation is no longer theoretical. It's here, written in code, printed in metal, and living in the hands of the American people. I'm Marc Beckman. This is Some Future Day. Cody Wilson, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining me on Some Future Day.
Thanks for the invitation, Mark.
Cody, people describe you as a gun rights activist. People describe you as a crypto anarchist, as a freedom of speech advocate. How would you describe yourself? Where do you fit in as it relates to these various descriptors?
Wow. Some of those people include me, for those descriptions. But I mean, when we used that term crypto anarchy and crypto anarchists 10 years ago, it felt futuristic. It felt like it was a way of suggesting Bitcoin was going to take over and become this kind of column, central spine of like internet technology, and all that stuff happened. And so now there's almost like a retrofuturism to crypto anarchy. It's almost like you're intentionally participating in something science fictional to continue to use the word, because so much of what we predicted is now just fact and life. And so do I need to be a crypto anarchist now to just say that, like, yeah, I believe in Bitcoin and I believe that Bitcoin will like overcome the state? I mean, that's a mainstream position. So I guess I'm saying I'm just a mainstream guy now.
Are you a mainstream
Oh,
guy? Are you
total
like a
mainstream guy.
Yeah.
I'm the consequence of what, if you take the internet and internet policy seriously, you end up becoming either me or there's not many good options. I'm one of the available outcomes in the choose your own adventure on the internet.
So would you say the system broke you? Are you a stallion that, like, a combination of federal, state, and local
Crazy.
government issues, lawmakers, getting into corporate? I know your business, it looks like, at least from an outsider's perspective, is very successful. Have you
Yes.
become, a byproduct of the system?
That's a fair question. I feel like the system has also been broken in a little bit, ever so slightly by me. So there's a kind of mutual breaking in, or, a kind of synthesis. So much of the success of our companies ended up becoming the fact that the State Department and public policy itself absorbed what we were doing and then tried to retranslate it into the law as a way of kind of containing, encapsulating, pretending that it had anticipated and understood what we were doing. So that's also an insight of mine. You can start it from any radical or vanguard position with enough success. And I mean, even like from a Marxist point of view, with enough success, the system, and this is a kind of cynical point of view, can find a way to absorb and basically try to represent you.
Well, I think that's an interesting declaration, because certainly with the advent of technology coupled with your vision of the world going back, 15 years ago or so, perhaps we pushed out this moment in time where, like, the federal government and the government, because of your philosophy, again, coupled with emerging technologies, in this like second phase, this new generation of gun control.
Mhm.
But yet it doesn't seem like they're able to keep up with it. I don't think that lawmakers have the ability to understand what you're doing as it relates to 3D printing and ghost guns. I don't think that they are working fast enough, as fast as the technology to protect individual rights coupled with people on the street. I also don't think law enforcement is capable of detecting 3D printed guns and now even 3D printed ammunition. So perhaps we're in this moment in time where, because of what you've done and the old system, we're in this second generation of gun control, but the lawmakers and the lawmaking ecosystem, the legal ecosystem, can't keep up yet. They don't understand it yet.
I think the categories you use are correct. I was more optimistic about law enforcement and, legislatures not understanding 3D guns 5 to 7 years ago, but it seems in important ways that they truly do, and even if they can't get the technology right and write laws that truly reflect that understanding, they use the kind of the standard gun control scare tactics in a science fictional, anticipatory dimension, and then they create, like, more despotic, reactionary laws. So, like, for example, California understands the Glock switch problem, that you can 3D print a little knickknack that makes your pistol into a machine gun, rather than try to understand the intricacies of how to filter that as a file or on the internet or something that you can't possess in California. California just decides to ban the entire Glock, which was always the goal of Generation 1 gun control. In
Right.
fact, the Brady campaign began as Handgun Control Incorporated at the advent of the Glock pistol. So there's a way that, like, we've kind of horseshoed back around through second generation lazy gun control politics back to universal or global gun control solutions, which may not stand up in the end, but there's such a fracturing happening at the level of federal courts and, a kind of a disrespect for the Supreme Court, that you'll end up seeing, like in the Ninth Circuit, you probably can't have a Glock 5 years from now, which is a consequence of 3D printed guns and a consequence of the fact that these legislatures can't actually handle the problem. But in the face of understanding that they can't handle the problem, it actually emboldens them for a more, let's say, like a less constitutional, more despotic solution.
Right. So if you were going to hone over an area in the country, whether it's state or even like if you want to expand federal, who do you think is doing it right
Who's
on
doing
the
gun?
government
Who's
side? On
doing
the
gun control
government
right?
side,
I mean, I have opinions about this, but I mean, the very worst offenders have been the very worst offenders when it comes to guns. That's New Jersey. California maintains a kind of shred of, legalistic credibility or something, but New York, New Jersey are always doing scary things. Who's doing it right? When you ask me that question, well, it's people who aren't, it's people who have a certain demographic and they're not concerned about gun politics on this level. They don't think about it. They think of it maybe in the oldest Republican sense that, like, well, popular ownership of arms is obviously like a fundament of civic participation in this country. Very few states really have that opinion or really reflect that opinion in their lawmaking. So far be it from me. I mean, even Texas has got kind of mid gun laws, but of course, I guess you'd expect someone like me to say that.
yeah. For sure, but it's interesting, when you talk about lazy lawmaking because there really is a slippery slope. When you talk about this nuance with regards to the Glock leading perhaps, to the total, elimination of that firearm in 5 years, what you're talking about is, in my opinion, either a total lack of understanding of the nuance itself from the lawmakers, or they get it, but they're using this opportunity. They're being opportunistic to shut it down.
Yeah, I think they get it enough. And I've actually watched California legislative sessions track with the changes to my own terms and conditions and products year to year. And so, like, this is not just because the politicians have got it, it's also because K Street's got it. The R Street Institute's got it. That Every Time for Gun Safety and the modern gun control movement work on this almost subscription basis where they are the kind of Rand Institute for gun control, and they will have up to the minute papers and ideas and symposia, and they will export that very capably to their representative lawmakers or to their. I mean, Mark Kelly got elected to the U.S. Senate. I mean, he did that on a gun control policy. So there's more astute gun control, like, let's say, policy to or think tank to policy pipeline for gun control these days. Some of that was perfected in the Biden years. Remember, the White House during the Biden presidency had an Office of Gun Violence Prevention in the building. So, they've not slackened in important respects, institutional respects.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, do you think, in your opinion, that the Democrat, the liberal perspective, as it relates to 3D printed guns, ghost guns, will actually ultimately have this chilling effect on iron pistols, or let's say the legacy
Yeah.
hardware?
Yeah, I do because Generation 1 gun control, I really like your generational definition earlier. Gen 1 gun control was all about, how do we scare people enough about, assault weapons and undetectable pistols and stuff. That didn't really work. But Gen 2 gun control, it can kind of like incorporate this, I don't know, cybernetic dimension, and it can bring in things like white nationalist terrorism and the kind of latest specters of the day, synthesize them all together and say, like, well, there's this deep web phenomena going on, and it's even worse than you can imagine. And it all seems to work better that way, at least at the state level. And so you actually end up getting state policy which far outruns what is possible to achieve at the federal level, which is all the same anyway, because of course these federal laws would almost be more swiftly taken down in federal court. But good luck going to New Jersey state court and breaking any New Jersey gun law. It's not going to happen. You got to go die for years, and then maybe you can escape into the federal system. So, gun control, Gen 2 gun control seems to understand and reflect this. There was a strategic pause, and now most of the advancements and experimentation are happening at the state level with, supermajorities, which know that their law really can't be credibly challenged in their state court systems.
So, Cody, let me ask you a question. I know that you've built like this really like incredible cult following, and in many ways, you're like a modern day mythical figure as it relates to the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, guns, innovation, etc. But then we started the conversation. We talked about the synthesis between the legal system, technology, and your philosophy, and then how you're also operating as a very successful business person. Would you take your legal mind? I know you had 2 years of education in law school, but clearly you understand how to, let's say, game the system as it relates to lawmaking, interpreting the law, and creating your policy, your terms and conditions, and beyond. Would you ever consider working with the federal government or the state government to bring your knowledge base to assist them in in creating laws that are better for gun owners?
That's such a great question because I'm so occulted now in my own space. I'm such
Yeah.
a cult figure that actually there are layers. There's a whole iceberg to this now, where many people hearing your question would say he already does work with the feds. It's actually there's so much synchronicity or things that like can't be coincidences that I'm actually accused of, which is a common thing on the internet these days. I'm accused of already working with
I
federal.
see that. Like some of your followers, your like most loyal followers
Yeah.
are upset with you,
Oh, absolutely,
which to
absolutely.
me was mind blowing when I was doing the research to meet you today. I was like, oh my God, when did this happen?
There's a deep form of, like, love and passion which ends up becoming a suspicion. Or you could say, like, that form of hate really is, like, the most loyal kind of following. And, of course, there's no evidence of this, but, like, how did this guy get his money? How does this guy keep anticipating things this way? And it's like, none of this can be coincidence. And, like, how did he beat those charges? Didn't this guy get, like, captured in Taiwan and brought back to the States? And, of course, some of their guys go down. One of their guys just went down in New York, with like 1,000 state charges. And they go, well, that's what would have really happened to him, if he wasn't an asset. And because 3D printed gun people are now starting to get the hammer across the country. And so it begins to look even more suspect that like somehow I can just kind of ride the wave here or the clouds or like stick around. I understand it on some level. And yet, like you say, like I think cult is the word. Like I also now retreat from explicating my business or my plans or like what I'm really trying to do because really that's the only way that it to maintain its energy. I can't be on Twitter engagement farming constantly and somehow still hoping that that maintains any strategic advantage for me. So there's a huge suspicion. I'm not really answering your question, but I'm answering it in spirit. Like, would I consider it? Well, yeah, sure, I'd consider it.
Well, look at it through this lens, Cody. Look at it through this lens. So you get all these like tech guys that are pretty big, and let's say if we want to focus for a minute on the AI piece or even on the crypto piece, like they jumped into Congress, they worked with Congress, they want to create obviously for their businesses a moat. So you're looking at people like Zuckerberg, Altman, like all those guys lined up during the Biden administration, and they're all amassing together around Trump, obviously. But for me, I was always saying, look, these guys really are looking to align with the federal government so
Yeah.
that they could protect their business interests and effectively push away the little entrepreneurs that are like nibbling, that could become competition eventually, but they just knock them out by creating a deeper moat with the federal and state government. So would you take that approach where you align with the lawmakers to give them true insight for legal making so that you can strengthen your business and strengthen the overall industry?
Again, and I acknowledge your question entirely. Again, I think that's been the accusation for me. I run a service called DEFCAD, which is the largest 3D printed gun file service on the internet. And people say, well, the only reason it succeeds is because he's integrated with the lawmakers and the lawmaking as it is, and he adjusts the policy of that website per state, you know, and tailors it to their policies. Sometimes as they're developed, before they're developed. Like, I'm watching the New York State Legislature, which has
Right.
twice tried to create a kind of anti 3D gun download law, which anticipates my website and my legal challenges and tries to talk about CDA 230 and all this stuff. So that accusation is there in the specific way you mean it. To answer your question, I was more involved with the government in the beginning. Uh, there's what was called the Congressional Second Amendment Caucus. It still exists in some form, but at that time it was led by Thomas Massey, who has a larger profile now than he did then. And these guys actually wanted to know. Ted Cruz was involved in this too. These guys wanted to know about the specifics of what I was doing, the technology, and how to tailor policy or how to block Democrat policy. There's less interest in it now, in fact, even though Trump has won and it's preferable to have Trump than his alternative in the election, the Department of Justice is against automatic Glocks as much as California is. And public policy from a Republican perspective, senatorial perspective, depends on how you, perhaps even the White House, does not does not hope for a brand new 3D printed gun future. Like there are lawsuits we're trying to settle right now, even after the Supreme Court's decision in Vanderstock, where the Department of Justice does not want to settle these suits with us, even though this is ostensibly a friendly department. So I can simply say, this is remaining neutral. The government has less of an interest now in talking to me. They know where I'm going and what I want to do. And in so many ways, I'm waiting on some things to go wrong for the government. And they know that. Like I don't want to settle and create a kind of stable policy position. I want to see how far we can get, understanding that that pushes not just the Overton window, but what becomes possible.
So it's interesting you mentioned DEFCAD. I think that's a nice segue into the legal issue that you're dealing with surrounding your platform, DEFCAD, and how you work strategically with regards to looking at federal and state law and then tailoring a business model against it. I guess the big issue here, just to keep it very simple, is whether or not 3D printed guns can be copyrighted. You want to talk a little bit about that DEFCAD lawsuit?
That's probably the biggest question this year about 3D guns, although it remains, again, a bit occulted because people are afraid to give public opinions about it from the 3D gun side. Obviously, I'll represent the position that 3D guns begin with an anti-copyright position. All the files are released with, when they are released with licenses, copyleft licenses, because 3D printed guns were trying to, and defense distributed companies like mine were trying to claim the legacy of open source and free software, which begins with copyleft. The GNU public licenses, open source licenses. We were trying to say this is the same type of thing. Software development in this space is also something that should be free and open source. That's been the first solid 10 years of 3D gun development. Only with the development of a mass public, let's say, of a huge hobby now, a huge array of business interests, enough people can come in and say, you know what, like traditional gun industry, actually, my designs aren't open source. And in fact, my designs are protected by federal law or state law. And you can't just copy my stuff without my permission. I have an authorial interest. That's a symptom of the fact that, there's enough money at stake now and enough people involved in the economy of 3D guns, that difference has arisen.
So this is what the plaintiff in the lawsuit in Florida is arguing effectively that DEFCAD is stealing the I think his name is Matthew I butcher his last name. Is it
Everyone
LaRoche?
does. Everyone does.
Right, but, that you're stealing, that DefCat is stealing. I think they might have pulled you into it individually too, but you're stealing the, copyright his copyright designs and selling them without permission, and it's kind of interesting, like, just focusing in on DefCat's $60 per year subscription, right? So you get a membership, you're paying for the membership, but
Yes.
you
Yeah.
could still upload for free, right? Open source
Yeah,
upload
anyone
all of the designs for free, right? But aren't you playing a little bit with the $60 a year subscription? Isn't that really just a way to kind of put a veil over what's really happening?
that's the right question, I think. But where copyright wasn't the first legal question in 3D guns, export law was at the time, and this is probably my best known lawsuit. I was fighting the US State Department over the
Yep.
question of dual use of the technology and whether the articles themselves, the files, were defense articles. Okay, if they are, and the State Department still regards many of them to be under the ITAR, you have to provide positive proof that the people that you're allowing to download are US persons. Or else you've committed an export violation. And, this is no joke. This is like huge, huge fines, six-figure fines, double figure, like decades in jail, all this stuff
Under ITAR.
under ITAR. And that was
Yep.
a big, long lawsuit, New York Times, all this stuff. I got
Yep.
Weinberg and NYU involved. I mean, all these people were involved, public knowledge. Okay. In the end, there was a settlement. It maybe wasn't that satisfying, but at the same time, in 2018, the law was changed and reflected that settlement in the actual Code of Federal Regulations, saying, okay, there may be some speech value to some of these guns. Nevertheless, most of the guns, most of the files for their receivers either fall on the commodity classification list or the ITAR, which means only US persons can download them, which means the only legal way that you can put these files on the internet to this day is through some kind of service or platform which checks who's downloading. Does that mean you have to charge money? It doesn't mean that. But of course, making those checks costs some money. And so I've built a way that like largely offsets those costs and is the equivalent of something like $5 a month to access these files and continue to take the risk that, I'm only serving US persons and continue to defend against that risk. That's the way the platform is built and why. And I haven't really changed, how much we're charging in years.
I mean, it seems reasonable. $5 a month isn't outrageous. What types of services, or goods, or what's the benefit if I'm a member? What do I get?
You would think I'd killed Christ though at that figure if you look,
I mean, it's not gonna make you rich, brother.
like $60. Well, that is that is worse than rape. If you ask some of the people in my space. But
Well, we have this spirit, right, Cody, where like capitalism is bad now, right? We've gone
okay,
through this major phase where like if you're self-made and you make a lot of money, that's bad. If you're capitalistic, that's bad. And there are only certain sets of individuals who should be able to really
yes,
capitalize within the American democracy,
yes,
right?
and it's
So you're
often
charging $5 a month? What do I get if I'm a member at DefCAD? What do I get for $5 a month?
yeah, you get the access to the repo, which is the single largest repository. You get access to that repo and unlimited downloads. You'd say, "Well, so what?" Well, many services charge you a similar amount or more for less. Of course, we try to add other value, to that subscription. That subscription lasts a year. We don't ever raise anyone's prices on well, if they've come in at a certain level. But I want to take your initial rhetorical point, which is that the only people criticizing this financial arrangement are those who pretend to be anti-capitalist, but are in fact themselves connected to a competing business, which is the whole basis of my current copyright lawsuit. This was just a competing form of a 3D gun business, trying to kind of relegate my business as impossible to advantage their own.
Well, look, your reputation as it relates to 3D printed guns and ghost guns is at the top of the pyramid. So, notwithstanding the fact that you're saying maybe some of the competition is charging less, you should probably theoretically be able to charge more because I would want to be a part of that culture that you've established,
I believe me. I mean, look, the membership
right?
numbers don't lie. I mean, there's an appetite in a market, and I'm certainly willing to charge more. especially in a changed policy scenario. But I don't know, I've kind of tuned this to how, it's relatively stable right now, and I'll take stability where I can get it because, of course, I don't just anticipate a copyright lawsuit or some kind of IP lawsuit. We've had a trademark lawsuit in the Southern District of New York, but I anticipate states themselves to sue me, like we've been discussing earlier, about the way that I've built the site. So I'm always trying to, I don't know, I need enough users and I need it to be popular and still somehow kind of soften or understand the popular prejudices against paying money. There's a, there's a diplomatic reason that I'm pricing it the way I am. I'm not just being a totally naked capitalist about it.
How many members do you have?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. Depending upon how you cut it, I would say DefCat has, 6 to 8,000 members. Some of those members are, I'm saying paying members.
Yeah, sure. That's what I'm talking about too. Like,
Um,
but is that list at risk if those people want to maintain a certain level of anonymity? You are, to a certain extent, you have a target on your back. No pun intended.
Absolutely.
If you have state and federal lawsuits coming at you all day long, is it possible that that list is going to be exposed?
Yes, in fact, that's one of the popular accusations about DefCat. Well, you shouldn't use it. Your customer info will be exposed, or customer info in the past has been exposed. Of course, this is not true. That customer info has never been stored at DefCat. It's never been available. There has been no list to be leaked or to be hacked. But I can understand that people, when we build the site, people want a privacy experience or some kind of guarantee. It's too
Sure.
risky. And fine, like the open internet's changing in the way that we knew it 20 years ago. You basically have to use an ID to use almost anything kind of spicy on the internet these days, and that's a shame. And it includes 3D printed guns. But should it be that way? I don't want it to be that way. And I would say if you want privacy, you know, you don't need to use my website. That's not me saying that your information is somehow preserved. I'm simply saying there are many alternatives to my website where you don't need to use a credit card or like risk, any communicating any identifiable information.
Cody, it's amazing how, like, you put yourself out from the outset as, such a pioneer, such a quote unquote rebel, risking so much personally. And now you have all of these, let's say Cody Wilson cult members who are like, all of a sudden the red flag goes up and they're like, well, maybe he's helping the government too much. He has access to our information. Is it at risk? There are fake names included on the list or fake names within the DefCAD community. Section 230 should be activated. Like, it's crazy how you've gone on such a path where, like, you were literally the only individual that I've read about that was putting everything at stake, everything at risk from the outset. And you have all these people shooting arrows at you now.
Well, it was like that in the beginning too. I think that's what people forget. People think it's just real sunny at the top of the pyramid, as you described,
Yeah.
but it was never that way. You're always feeling the point of the pyramid in your asshole. Okay, no matter how big that pyramid is. So look, it was always this way, and the gun culture hated it more in the beginning. People don't know this. They can't even conceive this anymore. But mainstream gun culture never wanted this, never liked this. Always thought I was suspicious and an outsider for doing this and doing it this way. And in many respects, that's never changed. But in another respect, this is what I want. Okay. Like Zarathustra doesn't want followers. Okay. He wants to be denied. He wants to be disavowed. All right. And you should surpass and overcome somebody like me. I mean, that's the only way. Yes, am I the leader of this thing? Still the leader of this thing. No one's been able to
Clearly.
overcome me. But I don't want followers. You understand?
Right. So how does 230 play into this whole copyright situation in Florida?
Well, 230 is more of like a defense against state laws. Like Congress had basically said, we privilege online platforms and we want to give them safe harbor and all this other these advantages on the open internet. A state law should not be able to touch, um, state censorship, things like that shouldn't be able to touch the way a platform works on the open internet. That's some of how 230 has evolved. Does 230 really matter in a private civil action in federal court for copyright? No, because federal actions, 230 doesn't really help you in most types of federal actions. So they're not really related.
Aren't some of your colleagues arguing that you've used created personas that aren't actually them to add legitimacy to DefCAD, and that's where 230 is coming into play?
They have argued that. It's just that that's
Can you
not.
explain that a little bit? Because I know I'm butchering it.
I can explain it, but you're not butchering it worse than they are. To accuse me of using false personas or something
Yeah.
on DEFCAD is not a federal claim. It doesn't give you a cause of action in federal court. You have no there's nothing you can do
So
about
there's no standing. Okay, legally there's no standing, but, if you're doing that, it's not cool.
No, no, in fact, I completely disagree. And one, I'm not admitting doing that. That's not something that I'm doing. Most often what you see, like in my current case, is them saying, "Well, we didn't upload some of these files," and he's pretending like we did. And
Right.
then, of course, that's not true. For almost all the files at issue in this case, that motherfucker uploaded those files. It's really funny. So it's kind of their own way of bending the facts and bending
Interesting.
public perception. Everyone's arguing about, not history and not the facts, but the memory of that history. And they want to shape public perception of how it went down. That's why this guy Jay Stark, his body basically, he's the biggest football in 3D printed guns. And people argue about what his philosophy was, what his life was, what it meant, what he believed, and what he would think now. This is true like religious tribal activity. Because no one wants to know the truth. People just want to argue about what it all meant.
Why don't people wanna know the truth, Cody?
Hey, the truth's a dangerous thing, right? Let's bring Nietzsche into the situation, right? A lot of people can't handle the truth. It's a poisonous thing, or like Churchill said, the truth is so fragile that it requires a bodyguard of lies. That's the tribal position of communities, just like 3D printed gun communities. There's no special claim to the truth here just because you're doing 3D printed gun work. In fact, the behavior is worse. I actually prefer the genteel, respectability of gun control lawyers in court compared to just the skullduggery that I've seen from these people.
Wow, that's remarkable. I wanna go back to the, United States Department of State, issue that you
Yeah.
raised before. We were talking about it started in the Department of State, right? The ITAR matter?
It did during the second Obama presidency.
Yeah, so something that I find interesting as it relates to that situation, and I'm curious if you can shine some light on it, please, is they settled and they took themselves out of the equation. It started with the Department of State because we were looking at, like, I think, a way to regulate guns, 3D printed guns, ghost guns. They said, okay, let's start with the Department of State because it gives us this reason to behave this way because of the international component, the exporting of code effectively.
Yes.
But then they moved away from it, and that to me means something. Like it seems like you were like hovering over a bigger issue there. Is there a reason why the Department doesn't wanna be involved? Like, why would they back off of it?
Yes, I think historically there's a reason, and then at
Yeah.
the time that we settled, there were clear political reasons which disfavored pushing the question. And OLC and people gave opinions saying, "Look, you guys shouldn't keep pushing this. This is gonna go there's a risk this won't go our way, and there will be some kind of big First Amendment thing, which will, prevent us from doing further stuff in the future for technologies that we actually care about, regulating technologies of the future, drone tech and all this other weird stuff." I don't know. You you risk a lot. So the State Department kind of opted out because it didn't actually think 3D printed guns were a serious, dual use technology with actual national security significance. That's the real answer, and that's the answer that we discovered at the time we were settling. But the State Department actually also knew that export control reform was happening, and all this stuff was being deregulated anyway. And that deregulation began with the second W. Bush administration. This had been a kind of long-standing policy goal, kind of independent of party politics. And you could say we're just a beneficiary of that process finally ending, but twice I had interrupted it by being a little too showy and running my mouth in the press and things like that. So you could also say that, like, I was my own biggest, obstacle to this settlement, and that there would have even been cleaner policy if I hadn't got involved.
So what about from an ethical perspective then? If we pull, we pull that thread through and we get back into the Supreme Court cases and everything. I mean, we have the there's this issue. I know this people are talking to you about this quite a bit, but I want you to share with my audience this issue of free speech, right? The information
Mhm.
versus when that information produces like a physical effect, a gun.
Yeah.
Uh, how do you morally justify the like? At what point, for you personally, does the moral justification go too when does it cross beyond where we are, like if for example artificial intelligence can create you go online and you can create a virus that can infect, an entire community, or you can
Mhm.
go online and use AI to attack critical infrastructure for a city, putting, hospitals at risk and, hurting the water supply. At what point does it go a little too far in your personal opinion?
Really good question, and I think maybe the first question I've been asked, since I started, the most consistent question I've been asked, and my answers change. Like, I do think I know virus researchers and gray hat hackers using AI to construct, like, some of the most vicious malware possible, and you could extend what they're doing to biotech and to weapons very
Yeah.
easily, and it's being done. And so there's this, like, direct acknowledgement that, of course, this is being done. And so what? Would you just define all this activity as a state secret, cabinet that way, and say that the American people themselves have no private right to engage in it, but of course it's something that must be done. We must, in the same way, like we developed organophosphates, like consciously as weapons or something. Look, we know they'll be developed. I try to, in the most serious way, if like I'm not trying to create a soundbite, I think of younger, I think of like, well, new subjectivities are possible. There's more to hope for. Like this is an old Baudrillard position. There's more to hope for in a world of nuclear weapons, and not a world of absolute deterrence, and a world that could kind of enforce or summon the terrorism required, and terrorism's the right word, to police every aspect of this. And this is kind of what Peter Thiel's saying, to create the kind of counter AI that could stop you from doing this, and the level of policing required on the internet to prevent this is the bigger moral crime, is the Antichrist. So I would say that, there are relevant moral questions. I'm a bit of an amoralist about them. I don't think morality is the sovereign impulse. I don't think it's the right way to even frame the questions when it comes to like 3D guns, for example. But I think it's a relevant question. I just think, when we define these things, we risk creating a world that's worse because of the fear.
Well, so it's interesting you say that because obviously, uh, I would assume you're a free speech absolutist, right?
I try to be.
Right.
I think
And there are reports that I read about recently. I read a report in Germany that showed that in Germany, the idea of being anti-Semitic, expressing anti-Semitism, is illegal, and as a result, anti-Semitism is on the rise.
yeah,
And I wonder, when we talk about the issue that you're going through right now with YouTube, if it's a similar situation whereby YouTube is suppressing your freedom of speech by taking down your content surrounding 3D printed guns and gun culture, but that might actually have a uh, chilling effect and create more more 3D gun
yeah.
production and manufacturing and usage.
It seems to. Like every single time I've been shut down, for example, in a big way, that ends up becoming an impetus for a much larger participation in the culture. Same thing with Mangione and the Kamala Harris people had planned all this new 3D gun crackdowns, which would have made it much more cool and popular online. And again, I agree, the censorship on YouTube makes it more attractive, makes it cooler than it is. And look, 3D printed gun people are not cool. They're getting some benefit from the fact that it's dangerous or unlawful in many cases to engage in the hobby. But if they were left to their own devices, they'd just be another species of Redditor. And so, like, it's actually more cool and attractive because it's opposed. And this works on multiple levels. Like, I'm only interested in it anymore because it's so difficult to do. Like, I'm that gradient of opposition is the only thing keeping even me attracted to it.
That's interesting. It's also interesting when you talk about the hobbyists because now there are kids like here in New York City. I'm sure you heard about this case where like there was a teenage boy that I think on the Upper East Side that was recently created a 3D printed gun, and I think it was over here in New York City where he shot his friend. There was another kid here in New York City that was like trading for fentanyl and
Yeah.
ended up dying from the fentanyl himself. Right? He gave the gun to a drug dealer and was paid in fentanyl. He wasn't going to
Mhm.
use the fentanyl.
Mhm.
So you have these individuals that I think some of them are really just not cognizant. They're not capable of adult like decisions as it relates to being a gun owner or working with, creating a gun. And I guess what's your standing as it relates to that younger generation? They have access to the files. They're into tech. Maybe it is to a certain extent a hobby for them, but they're tinkering in their apartment in New York City, and then somebody ends up dead. How do you think we should deal with those issues?
Yeah, I think this is an obvious consequence of 3D printing. In 2013, 14, people are saying, well, this is revolutionary. That revolution included this dimension. I mean, probably a lot of teenagers' first contact with pistols will be because they had a 3D printer. That's a fact. That's just how it is now. And because, we know that teenagers are internet natives, like, early technology adopters. I mean, I have seen firsthand many accounts of people saying, my very first gun, I made myself with a 3D printer. That was the first way they did it. It's not fictional anymore. It's just a fact of life. And that means a fact of young life and like how people will understand themselves and create identity and grow up, come of age.
Cody, do you think it would make sense for these individuals, like young kids, to have some kind of uh, level of regulation on 3D printed guns? Like, I don't know what it is. I'm just spitballing with
Right.
you, but like, imagine like
Yeah.
if they create a gun and that gun has to be registered or something like this.
Yeah, I would say, in fact, there's been another a century of gun control regulation, and in fact, in large part, this regulation's already there. The laws are already there. You certainly can't buy a gun at that age. For probably good reasons, good social reasons, which I respect. At the same time, you can make a gun, and so maybe the law should change. And I know New York and major metros are trying to change the law. In many major metros, you cannot 3D print a gun. You can no longer 3D print a gun, and this is probably from their point of view, an obvious and inevitable part of public policy. But it's also, a reflection and a symptom, I think, of what ideological decay, demographic problems. Like I, I don't think there are the same amount of teenagers killing each other and dying of fentanyl, like in El Paso, Texas, as there are in like Oakland, California. All right, well, this is to mention that there are social and civilizational mismatches happening, and the gun thing is a symptom of those things, not a cause.
So you think it's part of, on a local level, that community? It's part of that community's culture? Or is it part of frustration and angst with the system? Is it desperation? Where is it coming
I
from?
mean, this answer certainly requires a transdisciplinary perspective, right? And I'm not gonna be, one of the most reasonable voices here, okay? But I am part of the collaborative research, okay? And I know for a fact who's downloading, who wants this stuff, who buys it, who the most popular Polymer 80 customer was. There are separate gun cultures in this country. There's a separate Black urban youth gun culture, all right? You can go on Instagram right now and watch like a 6-year-old wave a Glock. Okay, he didn't 3D print it, but, like, he can pull it out of his pants just like, an older boy that he saw on the block. I mean, there are specific, new, distinct gun cultures, and 3D printing is a part of that and will accelerate or ferment those cultures, and allow them to go in the direction they were already going.
Do you think, I know again, this is like a tough answer because there are so many different markets that it applies to across the country, but do you think lawmakers and law enforcement are understanding the nuances of each community in the way that you envision it?
I think New York, and we actually had mentioned this before, but I think New York has got some of the best intelligence and is doing some of the best research. Whether they're actually interdicting on the ground in any meaningful way, I don't know. That's being used. What they are doing is being used, I think, effectively by New York State lawmakers, and to some degree nationally. But the ghost gun problem, quote unquote, amplified new techniques, and of course, there's state law enforcement participation with ATF and these intelligence rings. Like they've got a hold of the problem. And yet, we just went to a gun show in Fort Worth. Everybody and their dog, man, was selling super safeties. And I've been going to gun shows for a long time. We're in a new place, okay? People without websites, with just a phone number on the back of like a baggie, are selling a thing which is in this legal no man's land, which is effectively a machine gun conversion device. And like, it's easy money. There's video of them like selling them to each other at gas stations and stuff. I mean, this is accelerated to a dimension where even if New York law enforcement and intelligence understand the problem, there is not the manpower or the funding the time or the will or the scale to stop what is happening.
That's pretty scary. So, at what point do you think we cross the Rubicon? Are we there already? Are we at a point now?
Yeah, we crossed it in 2015. I mean, we crossed it in, depends on how you slice it. If you're talking about 3D guns, I mean,
Yeah,
ship has sailed, homeboy.
yeah. And then how long will it take until we see the legacy gun industry basically fade away? Because I would imagine as the technology continues to improve, I understand now there are 3D printed bullets that are, extremely effective, 3D printed explosives that are extremely effective. When do you see legacy iron pistols, those incredible American brands, Beretta, et cetera, just disappearing?
I don't know that you do, and, obviously Beretta is even older than America. I mean, it's a much older continental brand, but for example, so what? That's an 800-year-old gun brand. I don't think it's gonna disappear. It's like it's rather Lindy, right? The longer a gun company's been around, the longer it'll be around, is what I think. But, obviously the gun companies sustain themselves on big public contracts. So companies like Glock get sued for reasons of state. Glock is not an American company, and so Glock ends up becoming kind of punching bag in the United States, for example, for state policy reasons. These are this is complicated because at the same time, these gun control agencies, they don't and institutions, they don't really want guns themselves and the gun industry to dissolve because they see the gun industry itself now as the right way to do it. They just want a correctly policed substantial gun industry. What they don't want is this quasi-industrial thing where kind of anybody has got a desktop manufacturing mode at their disposal. They do not want that. But I'm not a Marxist. I don't think wither capitalism, wither gun capitalism. I don't think it goes away because of 3D printing. What I've seen is it hybridizes. People sell certain components that go into your already commercially manufactured gun, and it extends a certain degree of customization.
Do you think the Second Amendment is at risk?
The Second Amendment, as we have mythologized it and propped it up in cultural memory, probably never existed and therefore is always at risk and therefore exists by always being at risk in that way. And so, no, the Second Amendment is probably perfectly safe as an American myth of, sovereign individualism or kind of frontier mentality. The Second Amendment, as some people had hoped it would exist in the 80s and 90s, it may be at risk. I just don't know that there will be a country of people who will even share that understanding of the Second Amendment 30 years from now.
Interesting. What do you think Kash Patel and Pam Bondi are doing right now as it relates to just gun regulation in general, and then segueing into like their point of view as it relates to 3D printed guns?
I think Pam Bondi is not necessarily a pro Second Amendment person. That doesn't mean she's anti-gun. I think Cash he's definitely more avowedly pro Second Amendment. What I have seen from Pam Bondi's Department of Justice is mixed. There are good amicus briefs I've seen from the department saying that they believe the AR-15 is a part of the arms in common use and should be protected by the Second Amendment. That's great. Um, I don't know how well that will do. I would expect her Department of Justice to settle more cases than she has to stop fighting them, um, but it really hasn't. So I don't know. I see a Second Amendment which does actually reflect the Trump personality to a degree, where it's a cosmopolitan New York mentality. Doesn't really want a total free for all in gun rights, but it will say the right things, and it'll say the right things about the big issues that maintain the base, like the AR-15. So it's good. Is it great? No. Are these people really doing what they should for the Second Amendment? Not really by any Second Amendment radicals standard.
Well, I mean, you gotta like when you talk about like a city person, you mentioned Trump, but I'm a city person too. You gotta realize that like it's a little bit different, right? Like I am pro Second Amendment. I'm very public about it, but it's a little different in living in such a densely populated area when most of the gun crimes are occurring from, quote unquote, the bad guys, right? Like a big majority. I think it's like north of 80% of the gun crimes in New York City. I think it might even be closer to 90%. You might know better than me, Cody, but like I think it's around 80-90% of the crimes, gun crimes, are all the way like at that level.
Mm.
So, there's got to be some kind of situation here that makes sense where the right people have in a densely populated area like New York City are the ones, that are armed. I know that this might set you off, right? I,
No,
I
not
could
at
hear
all.
your,
Nothing
but
sets
like,
me off
but
here.
like, my business partner, for example, he lives, hours north of the city in an area where the local police won't get to his home in time to stop a crime. He should definitely have a gun there. He should live with a gun. There's no doubt about it. But and I know everything. I'm localizing on one issue, but it's different. Like you can't blame Trump for having that type of perspective.
No, I don't. In fact, I don't
Raised his kids
blame
here, it's
Trump is who he is, and, in so many ways is a total genius. His instincts are proven correct time and time again. I don't really criticize him beyond I'm just calling it as I see it. And my own study of the development of the Second Amendment and the development of gun control in the 20th century tells me that, like, gun control itself is this almost necessary phenomenon because of all the required municipal compromise, where you have all these people living on top of each other, and you have something like racial and civil war conditions in our 20th century. You still have them now. Okay, well, you're going there's going to be gun control. That's just an inevitable consequence of these almost unprecedented urban scenarios. So I understand it. At the same time, like any city person is going to understand there's going to be crazy random people like me who like persist in the internet and are difficult to deal with and like will make guns downloadable. And
Yeah.
this becomes another problem for the city, for the metropole.
For sure.
And here we are, ghosts in the shell, man.
Yeah, that's it. Cody, is there anything that you want to talk about that we haven't touched on?
I think this is an accurate representation of what's going on these days. Like a lot of people want to maintain a Second Amendment conversation in romantic, kind of backward-looking terms, like looking in the rearview mirror. Like, oh, well, let's talk about the people who need their shotguns and need their hunting rifles, and right, like you said, law enforcement's 20 minutes away, and it's like,
Right.
well, no, I'm interested in this cyberpunk frontier and these cyberpunk conditions. And punk is the right word, like the criminal mentality, the criminal persona is actually what's developing the most interesting technology here. And I'm not complimenting myself. I'm saying that the Glock switch and the super safety and these interstitial, specifically criminal spaces is where we're actually seeing the technology being used. And that's a good thing.
Cody, everyone who joins my show uh, participates in this fun little way that I ended. I basically lead with a sentence, the beginning of a sentence, and my guest finishes it. Are you game?
Was that the beginning of the sentence? I'm game. Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. In some future day, 3D guns in New York City will become.
The distant past.
Wow. The distant past. I can't speak. This is why I don't practice law. The distant past. That's incredible. Why do you think? You think it's going that quickly that it's just going to accelerate and there's going to be a new innovation that comes?
Yeah, I mean, isn't that's like the more optimistic, cultural point of view, right? Like humanity itself is one of these ideas which we may leave on the roadside.
Spoken like a true punk. I love it. Cody, thank you so much for joining me today. Truly, it's been very insightful and enjoyable to meet you.
Likewise, I hope we can do it again.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Some Future Day. I know your time is super valuable, so I hope you learned how you can leverage emerging technology to improve your life. And exciting news, my new book, Some Future Day, How AI is Going to Change Everything, is now available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, and other major booksellers across the globe. I am so proud to share that because of your support, the book topped the charts. It became #1 bestseller in cryptocurrency, #1 bestseller in artificial intelligence, and #1 bestseller in robotics. So, if you're curious and ready to learn how AI can enhance your career, your community, and your family, get yourself a copy today.